So today's subject, we have Chambolle Musigny 1er Cru, as seen through the eyes of two main growers, plus a couple of wines from Ghislane Barthod as well. And they're from two vineyards which are next door to each other, which I think Sebastian has printed you out a map. Merci, Sebastian. So Les Fuées is effectively a continuation of Bon Mar. And if you're right over on the right-hand or northern edge of Les Fuées, you've got a very similar soil. And then the rest of the Fuées, you get into much more classical Chambolle Musigny style, less of the wildness that you can get in Bon Mar. And then Les Cras is definitely that, because any vineyard called Cras in Burgundy means that it's a particularly chalky limestone soil without too much clay. And so the wines tend to be aromatic, very clean cut, good acid fruit balance, and wines with a good sense of structure without too much tannin. And that will be our case. We have Cras from Barthod and Roumier, and in fact there only are three producers who bottle their own Cras, the third being Hulot-Baillet, who's not bad but not quite in the same league. And everybody's got quite big holdings, and they all run from bottom of the vineyard up to the top. Roumier, as it happens, has got a little bit at the extreme left end of Les Cras, if you're looking at the map, but his big block is at the right end. And Ghislane Barthod is next to him at the left end, so more or less where the words LES are on the map. And you will see, in fact, in a different color, the village vineyard above is also called Les Cras. But first of all, there's a gap with a row of trees and so on, and there's a fault line, and then it's quite higher up on the slope, much less topsoil, and the wines are still very nice. It's a good village source, but it's clearly not the same interest as the 1er Cru. So that sets the scene for Cras. And for Fuées, it's a different story because it's much more divided up. Mostly the vineyards don't go up and down the slope. There are more little blocks here and there, and they can all have quite different characters. Brand. So if I have the right tasting sheet, you're going to start with a pair of Roumier's Les Cras 1615, and then have a pair of Mugnier Cras 1615. I think if I made a very specific hierarchy of the 1er Crus of Chambolle, I would put Fuées just a notch, or possibly only half a notch, ahead of Les Cras. Both of them are in a style which I like very much, rather more than the lower down 1er Crus. And they're two which have thus far, if anything, have benefited rather than suffered from global warming, which is not true throughout Chambolle Musigny. Tell you a little bit about the holdings. Christophe has got the biggest holding, 1 3/4 hectares of Les Cras, and I don't know the exact age of the vines, but they're a decent age now. He used to put it into the village Chambolle, but when the vines got mature enough, he separated it out, and that was in 1993. So I would think the vines date from the early 1970s. So a decent age. As always, they will be made with a proportion of whole bunches. We'll talk more about the winemaking perhaps when we look at the wines. And then the second biggest holder is Ghislane Barthod, who's got just under a hectare of Cras of a reasonable age, but they're not our oldest vines, which are in the Fuées, in fact, but we don't have one of her Fuées. And then Fred's Fuées, it's a holding of 0.71 of a hectare, and it was all planted in 1960, so they're decently old vines there. It's a wine which I always find sublime from his cellar, one of my real favorites, with an absolute purity of Chambolle Musigny fruit. I mean, you'd think of it more as a baby Musigny than you would as a baby Bon Mar, even though it's next door. Otherwise, your two vintages, 16 and 15, I don't taste either of them all that often at the moment because they're both pretty young, but they're no longer sort of the brand new vintages that people are showing you all the time. 16, of course, was the frost year, the first of the frost years before 21. And whereas in 21, I think it made it quite difficult to make really fine red wine, the quality-wise, the reds didn't seem to suffer at all in 16. I've had a lot which is very promising and are just a little bit more open than the 15s. 15, of course, one of the all-time great vintages, but probably a little bit in between being young and potentially impressive and actually starting to get really good. So 15s are giving me different results every time we taste them, between clearly being wonderful wines or wines which are in their sulky adolescent phase. Have you got 2 wines or 4 wines? You got all 4 in front of you?
All four,
yeah.
Yes.
Well, why don't you start in and have a taste of them? Up to you whether you do the 2 Roumiers and then the 2 Mugniers, or whether you do the 2 16s and the 2 15s. But I'll leave you for a minute or two just to taste your way through those. Well, I have a sip of herbal tea.
Jasper, for the car,
Yeah.
you can only, is it so only the bottom one is Premier, is only the bottom one's Premier Cru, is that
That's right?
So that only if it comes from there, then you can label it Premier Cru and you can't mix
Exactly.
it, right?
So, for example, Patrice and Michel Rion, their domain, they have Chambolle Musigny 1er Cras from the higher part, and it's just labeled as village. Yeah.
Jasper, how
Yeah.
many are these generally with stems, or what's the
Okay,
producers?
so in the case of Roumier, he uses stems, doesn't make that much of a fuss about it, and doesn't give you a precise answer. As time has gone along and with more warming, then the stem proportion has got a little bit higher, but it would be probably around about 50% for Les Cras at that period. And Mugnier, no stems at all, ever. Apart from that, their winemaking philosophies are relatively similar. They will both rack the wines from their original barrels after a year, and then put them back into barrel in another cellar for a few more months. Okay, if you've had a long enough, at least to have a brief taste. I've got myself 2 notes on the 2016 from Cras from Roumier. And interestingly, I quite often find that I'm reasonably optimistic in barrel, and then when you taste them later on, blind in bottle, they get slightly less good notes. But in this case, I gave it a decent sort of 4-star note when tasted from barrel. But when we had it as part of our blind Bergfest tastings, it came out with 5 stars. It was really good form. Fine, elegant mid-purple color, really engaging perfume nose with a few stems, elegance and nuance together. Utterly gorgeous, truly complete wine with a suave sweet fruit and the lift that stems bring. Bit of oak present, but everything's in balance. So still young, but very promising. And in fact, I gave it a bigger score than I did the previous year for the 2015, again, at the blind tasting. How's it showing with you?
The 15 initially was quite sulky for the Roumier Cras. The 16 straight off the blocks was quite a complete wine for me. No hard edges.
Yeah. I mean, that sort of no hard edge sophistication is, I think, something that began to get into Christophe's wines sort of in a few years after the turn of the century. But suddenly they began to get just that little bit more complete, a bit more purity, less edge to them. And I think that sort of really marked his coming of age. But is the 15 sort of growing in the glass or still a bit sulky?
I think it's growing in the glass.
It was definitely when I tasted it in at the Bergfest tasting would have been in 2018. So it was just going into its shell, and the oak was showing a little bit too much then. That was why I slightly marked it down on that occasion. But otherwise, I mean, it's a wine I'd expect to be beautiful. So actually, the Cras in his range and the Fuées in Fred's range, they do a similar sort of job. So you've already had a lovely village Chambolle Musigny, and then you go to a good Premier Cru, which just brings a lot more intensity to it. So, I mean, they are absolutely two favourites of mine even within the range of producers who are obviously extremely well thought of. Let's have a quick look online about my notes on 16 or 15 from Fred Mugnier. It's always intrigued me how different their wines are, and the fact that they often don't have successes in exactly the same years, given that they are next door to each other, vignerons of the same age, get on well. They don't do much that's different, apart from Christophe having stems and Fred not having any at all.
Jasper, do you think Barthod and I were just discussing that the 16 is, again, no hard edges, showing very well now. The 15, you know, the integrity of the fruit is there, it's great wine, but perhaps a little bit sulky. Do you think the 16 will go into that phase as well? Do you think this characteristic of the
No, I
vintage?
don't really. I think if it had been going to, it would have done so. I mean, there will be moments when they will come out. What often happens is you get something that's still young and it's promising and it's got intensity. And then there's a moment when it develops a velvet texture and sometimes a whole new dimension. There was a moment when 2002 just went through that from sort of not quite ugly duckling, but a little bit lean into something truly beautiful. So I think the 16s will at some point gain that additional velvet texture. But broadly speaking, I think they're going to maintain the profile that you see now for quite a while yet. Is the 16-15 sort of dichotomy replicated in Mugnier or not?
Yep, it is.
So here again, I gave the 16 a higher score when tasted in the blind of Bergfest compared to from barrel. They lost about 40% of the crop to frost, and then they also had a hailstorm that took a little bit more off, which didn't affect many vineyards, but their Fuées holding is the rows go from the north to the south, so i.e. parallel with the roads, and they suffered more from they were exposed to the hail worse than standard rows which go east-west up and down the slope. But when I tasted it blind, immense density of fruit, great weight across the palate, lively and concentrated, beautifully balanced, elegant and charming, grace and real grace, medium intensity. Quite a ripe dark fruit, but sleek and stylish. So I gave it 4 stars and 94 points, which was at the top of the range when tasted in barrel. I wasn't sure about the again in that blind tasting at sort of 3 years old. The 2015 was difficult and possibly that bottle was not quite clean. So I left a sort of ambiguous note to it. But is it showing fine today, but just not as easy to appreciate as the 16?
I think it's showing. I don't know what everyone else thinks. I think it's showing very well. Actually, yeah. But it's interesting that the 215s and the 216s both show that kind of similar vintage characteristic. The elegance of the 16, which actually is a vintage reminds me of an 02 at a similar age. You mentioned it.
Yeah.
Now, right? And then the 15s are a bit more sort of earthy, a bit more kind of muscular, but actually very nice. Very nice.
But you could sort of, albeit, Richard, you probably rather leave them for another 25 or 30 years, but you can imagine drinking a 2016 now, but the 15s clearly best to put them away.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so.
Good. And if you had to choose one pairing over the other pairing in by producer, judging just from these wines, would you have a preference?
I'll go La Croix.
You go to Croix? I go to
I think there's perhaps a little more interest in the Mugnier. There's just a little more detail where the Cras, they're great wines, but I think the Fuées just has a little bit more interesting.
So, but round the table, broadly, I mean, it could be either way around. There's not a clear preference. Good. Comfortable with that. And I know them both well. I like them both a lot. The market's quite keen on Mugnier, but is hugely keen on Roumier. So I haven't checked out current market prices, if there are such things on these wines, but I'm guessing that the Roumier Cras is going to come out rather higher than the Mugnier. Let's have a look. Les Cras, 2016. 740, 2015, 844.
Yeah, that's what Mike is asking if it's similar volume that they produce.
No, they'll be in terms of their holdings, Christophe has got nearly twice as much Cras as Fred has Fuées.
That's why the Fuées is so hard to find.
Yeah, I think the Fuées 16 for me is probably my pick. Like the 15's in the longer term.
Hello. Yeah, according to Wine Searcher, actually the Fuées is getting a premium over the Roumier Cras.
Yes,
It may be to do with volume, and it may be to do, of course, that there are many fewer wines to choose from Fred, whereas Christophe has quite a wide range, getting wider all the time because there's now a second block of Echezeaux has joined, and there is Richebourg for the first time, or will be. I'm not sure which year it kicks in, whether it's probably 24, I'm not sure. So more and more happening at the Roumier domain. Okay.
Sorry, Jasper, just a quick one. I always thought that Cras and Roumier and Fuées for Mugnier were the kind of value buys from both producers, but sadly no longer.
They were the what of the two producers?
The value buys.
Oh yeah, well, yes. Yep. But you know what these things cost from the domain and what they cost on secondary market often have nothing in common. Right, so time to get your Roumier boots on and look at the 10, 9, and 7. You would have the argument about 10 and 9, and you'd expect the 7 to be quite a long way behind. But in the case of Christophe Roumier, for some reason which he can't necessarily explain and nobody else can, he made amazing 07s, which are way ahead of the general run of things and probably ahead in relative quality of anybody else's 2007s. I mean, it was just a year when everything chimed in perfectly for him. Having had it not done quite so well in 06, he bounced right back with 7. And then 9 and 10, I have my views, but we'll wait till you've tasted them. Do you have the wines yet?
We do.
We do.
Great. Well, leap in and have a taste.
Yeah, Jasper, we were also talking about, like, you know, for a first fight, if we were to blind them, we wouldn't know who's using stem and who's not.
Yeah. So it's the same throughout here. No stems with Mugnier, no stems with Barthod, and Christophe stems, but he doesn't usually specify how many. These days, it's about 50%. Once you get back to the older vintages in this tasting, it'll be more like only a third. None of them goes overboard with new oak either. Never have. Quick update. Bit of information was in the first edition of my book, but got cut out for the second. But some of the vines in the Roumier les Cras go back to 1928, but most of them are more recent from the 70s, as I suggested.
Thank goodness you told us that, Jasper. Thank you.
Okay. 10, 9, 7. Who wants to pronounce on how they're showing?
As an expert on 2007, Jasper, as you know,
yes.
I actually think the 7 is showing the best of the 3.
Good. Yeah. So, as I said, we don't really know why he got it so right, but his wines are much more intense in 7 than most people's are. Of the smattering I've got in my own cellar, I've actually really just been drinking the Bourgogne Rouge and thinking I could even leave that longer if I wanted to. But you know, I have the classic English palate that likes to hold things for longer rather than a shorter period. Then 9 and 10. I remember that when COVID lockdowns happened for the first time, and 67 Pall Mall put in place the first of our sort of tasting Zooms, there were more chats, and at that point they hadn't worked out a way that at least in the UK and Europe they could send little sample bottles around. So at that point I was just tasting some wines on air, and I chose the Village Chambolle 09 and 10 from Christophe in order to look at those 2 vintages where there was the claim that 09 was the great one to begin with, and then an awful lot of people started preferring 10. And my take on it, which has been borne out more often than not since, is that 10 is much prettier, much more attractive, but it is lighter, and it is at village level for sure, and maybe sometimes above that, almost fully ready for drinking. Whereas 09s have barely started to show what they have got. So I'm expecting the 10 to be slightly lighter in colour and slightly more charming and approachable, and the 09 still to be quite burly, maybe even a bit tannic.
That's pretty much nailed it.
I think that's spot on, actually.
Because
my word, I can keep my MW then.
We'll ask you a few questions later, Jasper, and then I think the 09 is super salty at the moment for me. The 10 is. And I'm surprised by the weight of fruit, like you said, Jasper. The weight of fruit in the 07, I would not have expected it.
Yeah, it is an anomaly on the good side. I must admit. Yeah, so 10s. I'm now thinking, if I want to have something not too old but that's really nice to drink, then 10 I'm looking at. And 9s I'm just not bothering to pull out and taste at the moment. But I do believe in 09 in the long term. I think the concentration of tannins, without them being rough because they were ripe, but the concentration of tannins is enormous. And what do you feel about the overall quality? Are they where you would expect and hope a Roumier Cras to be?
Yeah. I think this flight in particular shows you the quality of the terroir of that.
I did have a conversation with Christophe once about 8 or 10 years ago when he was starting to get worried about the sort of the cult building up and people paying too much for his wine. I said, Christophe, I've got an idea. Send out some really horrible bottles of wine to all the journalists so that they will start giving you very bad scores. And then we will know, the informed will know that actually the real wines are very good indeed still, and we'll be able to buy them for sensible prices. And he was interested for a moment, but felt it was slightly too high risk a strategy.
Do you guys think with time the 9 is the best of the 3?
No,
Sure.
no,
No, I wouldn't.
No, I do. I couldn't. I couldn't.
I wouldn't.
I didn't hear the question on the 9 because you weren't close enough to the machine.
Jasper, do you think of the 9, 7, 9, and 10? Will
Yeah.
the 9 be the longest living or the best over time?
I think eventually the 9 will be the best, but there's something special about that 7, and then 10 is just lovely. I mean, you know, you don't want any of them not to win, if you see what I mean. But the 9, if we try the wines in 25 years' time, I think the 9 will be the winner. So a note in your diaries, gentlemen, to return in 25 years.
I'm free. I mean,
Could it be like 99? Do you think it could ever be like 99 where it never really, you know, at the moment 99 is never really.
Well, actually, I did a tasting on Tuesday night of 99s from Clive's cellar, and they were several of them were absolutely singing. We had 5 Premier Crus from the Côte de Beaune, including Lafarge, Clos des Epineux, and various other things. And we had 5 mostly Premier Crus, but with Ingros, Clos Vougeot in there from the Côte de Nuit. And the winner overall, you'll be amazed to hear, was a red Chassagne Montrachet, the Clos de la Boudriotte from Ramonet. His 99, it's just absolutely sublime and fully ready to drink now. But Lafarge was very good. Pommard Clos des Epineux was very good. Ingros was fully ready to drink. The Lafarge took a bit of time. The Griveau was a bit too tannic and sulky. And we also had the Barthod les Cras, which began hard and sulky and developed into a really beautiful wine. But no, I have absolutely no worries about how 99. I mean, I still believe in that vintage absolutely, and I don't find them too ugly. We didn't have the best of tastings in Hong Kong in January about them because it turned out afterwards to be a particularly dismal day in the biodynamic calendar for tasting wines. But that was atypically slightly below par. Would you like to progress to the next 3?
Yes.
yeah.
After which I will probably talk through the remaining 6, but we'll leave you to taste them. I bet you that those 3 are going to go on changing in the glass, and you know, you'll change your preferences. So we got coming up 3 2005s, 1 from each of the producers, and this is the vintage which, as you remember, I absolutely loved at the time, and it then did definitely go into its shell, and in many instances hasn't really wanted to come out again yet. But so I'm listening into the chat. 2015 is beginning to. Right. Do you have the 3 2005s and how are they looking?
2.
It's coming around.
All right, they're just coming around now. Okay. So you've got a Cras Fuées Cras sandwich.
Jasper, what's your view on decanting the Burgundies generically versus Bordeaux?
So the standard view in sort of French sommelier school is you get thrown out of school if you ever decant a red Burgundy. So I tend not to. I might do it if I was serving a wine which I knew to be both too young and of a tannic vintage. So I might do it with the 2015s, for example, or possibly even 2009. I would never do it with an older red Burgundy, though, because they tend, sometimes the fruit just sort of disappears. The only advantage of decanting for an occasion like tonight is that by decanting, you mean that everybody gets exactly the wine tasting in the same way, whereas otherwise there can be a bit of a difference between the top of the bottle and the bottom of the bottle. But in general, I've been too much conditioned by the original teaching, so I tend not to. I would decant white Burgundies. Come to think of it, 2005 is a vintage that might enjoy being decanted.
So what was that, Jasper?
Well, 2005 is actually a vintage, with its tannic background that one could decant. But equally, you've got the opportunity tonight to let them grow up in the glass and watch how they change. Ghislane Barthod, the vines come from the Noëlla family. Her mother's father was a Marcel Noëlla, and her mother married Gaston Barthod, great domain Barthod Noëlla. And interestingly, I mean, all three of the producers we're talking about are approximately the same age as me also. So Frederick was born in 1955, and Christophe and Ghislane are both from 1958. And so they're all now not necessarily retiring, but reaching retirement age. And in fact, just the last three vintages probably at Barthod have been made by her son Clement, who is a good 2 meters tall. He's taller than me. So he's taken over his mother's domain, Barthod, his father's domain, Louis Boyau, the domain which his father also started in the Beaujolais in Moulin-Vent. Plus, he's head of the village sort of syndicat for the appellation. Plus, he's sort of newly set up house with his partner, and so on and so forth. So he's a busy boy. So their holding of Cras, they have amazingly, I think it's now either 11 or 12 different Chambolle Musigny 1er Cras that they bottle. They have no Grand Crus, except they've called their dog Musigny in order to have some Grand Cru in the house. But apart from that, they've got Bourgogne, Rouge, Village Chambolle, and then 12, I think it is, 1er Cras. And they make all of them separately. And my three favorites, my two favorites would be Cras and Fuées. I also like Beaubrun and terroir as well, but Cras and Fuées are both wonderful. I don't have a specific age on the Cras, but they're not young vines. And nowadays, but not necessarily this far back, they nowadays pick very early. They thought they picked the very first of anyone in the village to pick in 2009, and still felt they might have picked too late. So since then, they are always amongst the first. They make wines which do age very well, entirely destemmed, and again, no significant proportion of new oak in the cellar. And again, racked once just before the new harvest, but then spend the second winter back in barrel. So there's really nothing particularly significant in the way they make the wine compared to Fred Munier, for example. Of these three, the only one, no, I did a little tasting in May 2019 at Berry Brothers, was invited back, and we did a little dinner event looking at the 2005 vintage, and I chose a flight of 3 Chambolle Musignies, and they included the Cras from Roumier, the Cras from Barthod, and just a village Chambolle from Fred. I'll tell you after you've given your view as what order they came out. But any thoughts? Is Barthod standing up in the same company, or?
I don't think it's as sharp though. There's a little bit of like rusticity to it. I think like Mugnier is like very precise, clean.
Yeah. Like
around the edges. Barthod has like a little bit of like like rusticness to it. So I think my preference for Mugnier and then Roumier and then Barthod.
So on the Barthod, it's just the acidity is a bit angular and just taking away a little bit of the pleasure.
probably not, just a little bit, not quite the precision of the Roumier and the Mugnier for me.
Right.
But, like,
Yeah.
you're being very critical right now.
Yes. No, I mean, I think that would be the general perception, is that Roumier and Mugnier are in the very highest class, and Barthod is an extremely good producer, but perhaps not quite up there with those two. On that evening in May 2019, we just had the village Chambolle from Fred, and it was nice enough, and I gave it 91 points. The Barthod Cras got 92 points, and the Roumier did come out on top. So if I've got any particularly interesting tasting notes. Les Cras, firm and powerful, fruits abundant, and the tannins, while still requiring a while yet to integrate, don't dominate awkwardly. So I liked the Cras, and then the 2005 Cras, tasted 5 years ago. I said, no question, but this is heading towards a great place. I'll give it another 5 years to get there. Well, you've got that 5 years. I noted explosion of deep, dark raspberry fruit on the palate, more than covering the tannins. Yeah. The bouquet was still quite ungiving.
The Fuées 05 is really outstanding. And I find the Roumier Cras a bit kind of clunky and almost rustic style. It's not. It doesn't have that kind of.
Not quite singing today.
No, not quite.
No.
Anyone else like to pronounce, Chris? Would you like to pronounce on the 305s there?
My favourite is the Fuées.
Yeah.
I have a little fondness for the Barthod, actually. I think it's drinking very well. The Barthod is maybe a little bit of a window to how the others might end up. Well, not end up, but I think it's probably a little more advanced than the other two. They might do, but Fuées right now is definitely the finest one.
Right.
In fact,
Okay.
probably my favourite wines.
Yeah.
I have a certain family member who's got a birthday quite soon. I've been wondering which particular wine to pull out. Maybe we'll give that one a roll. What you've got to follow, but I'm not in fact going to stay with you for it, but just to put down some markers. You've got two 2002s and a 1999. So the Roumier 1999, it could still be a little bit backward, like the 05, or it could be absolutely singing. I would certainly hope that the 02s are in a very good place. A vintage I like a lot, a little bit lighter, but it's pretty much ready for drinking. So that should help. And then you've got two 98s and a 95. The one thing I would say is about the 95, that again is a vintage in which Christophe is supposed to have outperformed the others. In fact, it's a year in which everybody in Chambolle did, and everybody in Volnay did rather well, better than their neighbours. So that should be a lovely way to finish. And the 98s could be a little bit edgy. I don't think they will be too mature. They could actually surprise and deliver much more than the reputation of the vintage. But it'll be fascinating for you to have a Roumier and a Mugnier side by side in a year during a period when they didn't always both do well in the same years. So I look forward to hearing back in due course how they went. So while I'm still with you, are there any questions arising out of today's tasting that you would like?
Jasper, in the modern day hierarchy of the village of Chambolle, obviously we're looking at 3 of the great producers now, but you don't have to be completely exact. But you know, who in your view are sort of like the top five producers in Chambolle now?
Right. So we've agreed that we got Roumier and Mugnier, I think will be in everybody's. De Vogüé now has a new winemaker, and I've been very excited about the last couple of vintages. So they've got to be in there. I'm still uncertain as to whether under the previous regime the wines are less good than we'd hoped, or they just need such a long time before you can make a safe judgment, and that they do start to get better again, having gone missing in between. So they ought to be in the conversation. Barthod should be in the conversation, and probably the other one, which no, I've got two more to name before I narrow them down. One is Fuées Barthod, who only has small holdings. They're all in Chambolle. He's quite a shy creature. You know, he doesn't sort of go around the world doing tastings. But his wines are rather, you know, attractively perfumed in an almost an old-fashioned style. But I haven't tasted his recent offerings. But the other one, who I think is extremely good, and he has a wide range of wines, so one doesn't always think of him as a Chambolle Musigny producer because he's got so many other things as well. And he doesn't have Musigny and Bon Mar or Amoureuse, but Gilbert Felletig. He's got quite a few Chambolle Premier Crus, and he would definitely be in my ratings. I'm just trying to think if I've. It's such a nice village, Chambolle, and they're all really friendly and sort of support each other. You don't get any of the jealousy that you get in a few. Amiot-Saval, I haven't mentioned. There's a small one called de Royer. Hudelot-Baillet. There's one thing about their wines, they're nearly extremely good, but they just need to sort of soften the finish so that the wines flow through a little bit better. They're just slightly firm otherwise. And yep, there's also the Bain Sigaud, now Anne Sigaud, taken over from her retired husband. And they have a very good cuvée called Premier Cru Les Noireaux. So yeah, I mean, there's hardly anybody who's clearly underperforming in Chambolle. It's good news. Right. Well, until we meet again, we're trying to get hold of Jean-Marie Fourier, but don't have any definite news for you on that yet. But otherwise, I will leave you to enjoy the remaining wines, all the food that will be waiting in the wings, and to keep tasting what you've already got in your glasses to see how they change. So thank you very much indeed, and see you all again.
One sec, Jasper.
I have one more question.
Right.
From what you've said about Chambolle, would you say, in terms of producers, it's probably the most consistent village in terms of producers?
You could probably argue that. I mean, it's easier to do when you're a very small village. And of course, it's also true that across the board, Burgundy is so much more consistent than it was before. There's a lot that's really good going on next door in Moray Saint-Denis as well, but maybe one or two who I think aren't quite pulling their weight. Yeah. Yeah, let's give that crown to Chambolle. Why not?
Do you want to name them?
I'll go around and tell them all what I've done and wait for the bottles to flow. But, I wouldn't do such a thing. Yeah. Anyway, and Chambolle and Moray get on well together. They've just done a big thing, the Saint Vincent Tournant celebration, which normally is a single village, and they've done it together. But more often than not, you get villages next door to each other, which are sort of real rivals and don't like each other. Good. Well, thank you all, and well done, everybody. I shall get on with writing up my next set of tasting notes, and I'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.